about this.
You've just taught me how I need to write content.
Tell me more.
I haven't hardly rehearsed this podcast because I've just been writing reams in response to the questions that you sent me.
I love it, because you don't realize that you've got everything already in you, because you live and breathe it. For others who don't have your knowledge and expertise, it's like, oh, but why is it even important? Yeah, basic questions that are simple for you, but it's not simple for the rest of us.
I know. So I have, yes, let's hope I can read my notes, because I'm like, oh my God, I haven't even gone through them properly. But anyway.
Oh, you don't need notes. We have got a good conversation, and this is the best bit, because this is how, you know, you are a trusted authority, meaning you connect your expertise and your science-backed information with your personal stories. And you need to trust yourself that you've got them ready to go, because you've worked with hundreds and thousands of leaders already. No biggie for you.
Oh, yes.
Oh, so excited. It's going to be a good chat. Okay. Should we get started?
Yes, let's do it.
Okay. We need to talk. This is usually a sentence that's dreaded by most of us, because we already have the sweaty imagination as to, oh my God, what comes next? What did I do wrong? Do I get fired? Or whatever else it might be. So having those tough conversations isn't something that's natural to us, or we proactively seek out because we want to avoid rejection or these negative feelings that are usually associated with having those tough conversations. Having said all of that, having those tough conversations is a big part of being and becoming a leader, maybe a thought leader or a leader of people. And today we are joined by somebody who has made it her profession and her passion to make those tough conversations not only more effective and efficient, but also more enjoyable. We are joined by Kate Crawshaw. Kate, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me, Petra. It's very exciting.
So exciting. And I'm honestly looking forward to also learning a lot more, because I put my hand up to say I'm not proactively seeking out those tough conversations. Having said that, I have to have at least 3 tough conversations a week, maybe with a client, maybe with a partner, maybe with a friend. So I'm really curious to get us started. What got you into the space of teaching people how to have those tough conversations?
It's really interesting, and some of it is about what you've just said, which is lived experience. So for me, I'm so passionate about great workplaces, and you know, I'd had lots and lots of damaging conversations. So whether that was me being involved, someone bringing me into a conversation with bad outcomes, or even where I had instigated a conversation and it hadn't gone as well as I would have liked. And we all avoid conversations all the time. So for me, there was that impetus to really see how I could solve that problem, which fortunately marries very well with my company's approach to training, which is using an experiential learning framework. So, you know, we've talked about it before, that the billions of dollars that are lost every year through corporate training that just doesn't really have any impact. And you know, the soft skills that you need to build up during when you're doing difficult conversations training, you can't learn through a PowerPoint. You know, you can't build self-awareness and the skills and the confidence to be able to have these conversations without practicing them and experiencing them for yourself personally. So we learn from this experience, and so the approach, my own need to solve this problem really marries well with the approach and the philosophy that Serious Woo takes. So it's been a fabulous journey over the last 5 years.
I bet. And you said correctly that it isn't something that we could just learn from a PowerPoint presentation. And there is so much guidance in terms of how to present better, how to regulate your voice, and, you know, only focus on the external part. But nobody gives us a script or prepares us how to have those tough conversations, because there's so much more involved than just rehearsing and looking good. So let's go back to the core. Why do we even have to have those tough conversations?
Well, you know, as leaders, it's our job. I mean, you mentioned it before. It doesn't matter whether you're a small business owner, whether you, you're an executive of a large multinational, or whether you're in a relationship. You've got to, you need to be able to have difficult conversations. And as from a leadership perspective, it's easy for us to focus on the tasks and not take the time for people. Tasks sit there on our to-do list. We need to get that report done. We need to do all these kind of things. And we lose sight of the fact that the relationships we have and the psychological safety that we need to build with our internal stakeholders and our external stakeholders is actually the thing that is going to help our task list get done. So from that perspective, the higher up the ladder we get, the more time we actually need to allocate for these conversations. And we need to establish expectations around work, manage behaviours. We need to communicate what we want, and we need to give and receive feedback. So from just our day-to-day working, it's really critical. And there's actually also legal obligations now as far as leadership around the positive duty of care that we have to have around equal opportunity and sex discrimination. And also from a occupational health and safety perspective as well, we have to create a psychologically safe workplace for the rest of our team. So there's some obvious, very personal issues, but also from an organisational perspective, it's really important that leaders have these conversations regularly.
Absolutely. And you mentioned two really important points. Firstly, being a technical leader is a lot easier because you are focusing on the task. And this is something that we're comfortable with because we've usually done it for years and we're pretty good at it. So it's easy to delegate that to others. Having said that, nowadays we've got different topics to address. And this actually leads me to another question. Have you seen the topics that leaders have to address have changed over the last 2 years, probably, post-pandemic?
It's interesting because there's definitely, I know Microsoft has done a report on this, there's a decline in team connection and conversation. So remote working has really impacted on that. And that, again, those conversations have tended to be task-based. So they've really impacted on relationships. But I think the actual topics that are happening now at the moment is, issues surrounding return to work. So the negotiation now of hybrid working, the expectations, I think people have had time to reflect on what their working preferences are as a team, which may actually be different to what they were 2 years ago. So there is a lot of negotiation happening within teams about, that kind of storming and norming again after the pandemic. Wellbeing check-ins is another topic of conversation. So leaders struggling with how to regularly check in with their teams, make sure everything is okay, and offer them support in a way that's not necessarily prying into their personal lives if they're not wanting to divulge specific information, because we've had a lot of mental health issues as a cause of consequence of the pandemic. And another topic that we're seeing a lot in our work that isn't necessarily linked to the last 2 years, but is happening a lot, is exclusion and bullying. So really calling out those behaviours when they happen early to try and prevent them from escalating and causing a workplace or even a work cover issue.
And these are massive topics. And I don't think that ever in history, leaders had to deal with those kind of topics and issues. And we can't say, well, what did we do 5 or 10 years ago? Because those topics weren't there. We can't reflect on previous experience and see how we can learn from that again. And also usually leadership, and you would know it better than anyone else, you get promoted in the role and then you figure things out just because you were good doing the doing. And now you have to actually get other people to do their best. What is a transition that we lack, but we actually need if we go from the technical expert to a leader?
Yeah, it's really interesting because a lot of people do get promoted for their in many industries for their technical expertise, and they end up then being in a completely different role, and it can be very challenging. And one of the things is leaders need to understand in that people, when dealing with people, is that you do not need to be the expert when you start a conversation. So it's pretty much the antithesis of what a lot of people are used to and comfortable with. And, starting a conversation which is curious and really actually has the intent of wanting to know the perspective of that person. And just because someone shares their perspective with you does not mean that they are right or that you have to follow whatever they said, but they need to be listened to. And I think creating that space for that dialogue where you're opening up the questions, you're listening to people's feedback and giving them space is so key. And one of the biggest things that we see currently working with a large organisation and rolling out program to 500 of their leaders. So we're interviewing, we're doing work and scenario work, role play work with actors with 500 managers. And we can see there's a real reluctance to just be open and ask open-ended questions and listen.
I'm glad you mentioned that in terms of you don't need to have the answer, because this is how we programmed. And this is also why you got promoted, because you were the one who knew the answers, who could do the doing. And now you get into a situation where you don't know the answer. And this uncertainty, I think this is something that we don't feel comfortable with because we can't predict the outcome. What other reasons are there that we feel so uncomfortable with those situations? This is what I love about your work, that you create real life scenarios that we feel how it would be if we have those conversations in a safe space. So when we are going out in the real world, we actually know how to respond and react to them. So what are those reasons that we feel so reluctant to address those topics?
Oh, there are so many reasons, so many reasons. And they're personal and they're universal as well. So, things can be around being scared of the response. You might be someone who avoids aggression. You might be worried about how you'll be perceived. You don't want to be liked, disliked. You don't want to have to tell someone that they have to improve their performance if you think that the response is going to be negative. You might work in a culture that doesn't support these kind of conversations and feedback. So, what we hear a lot is this idea of a career limiting move about bringing, especially around feedbacks when we're looking at upward management, all that kind of thing. There's a lot of different reasons, all personal and can have massive blockers. And one of the things that we say during the training is that there's no magic bullet to take away the emotion of how you'll feel when you engage when you start a conversation like this. You're always going to feel some level of nervousness and uncomfortability. That is just part and parcel with these kind of conversations. But what we can give you is frameworks and confidence and practice to mean that you know how to negotiate them better and you're prepared for different responses.
And that's such a great approach to it, even just managing the expectations. Like, we don't have the silver bullet that you just go in, you feel comfortable, you lead the conversation and magnetize the room and you're good to go. It doesn't happen because every single person is different. Now, is there a framework or for us to decide easier when is it good to have this tough conversation and when is it maybe too early, or is it better to let it go because it would cause an even bigger issue? How do we know which direction to take?
It's a great question, and I think that the answer is you should always have the conversation. So one of the issues is that proactive conversations at an early intervention is much better than getting to a stage where something has escalated or snowballed to an extent where it's going to be a really tough conversation. So we see this a lot, there's that little, as a small business owner, you're having some little bit of uncomfortability about where the conversation's going with your client, but everything is saying, oh no, I don't want to go down that path, but just asking open and curious questions. So really that idea of an open question or asking a clarifying question to ensure that you're both on the same page early on is much better than getting to a stage where there's a real clash on expectations about work outcomes or something like that. So it's much better to have conversations earlier that are around small issues, small behavioural issues for people who are managing teams and that kind of thing, than waiting till they escalate to something much hairier and more difficult to handle.
Absolutely. And I think we've all been in a situation where we said, oh, I'll just do this email or this, anything to procrastinate, to not have this tough conversation. And then everything goes on in your mind. Oh, what if they fire me? What if they this and this and this? And then you have got such a negative feeling that it gets even worse. So you're dragging out the conversation. And then, this is where S hits the fan.
Oh, I think, I remember years ago lying in bed at night, like, role playing in my head, the dialogue of what would happen and that kind of thing. And interestingly, there was a study done in the UK to show that people who had these conversations actually have better immune systems than those people that avoid them. So, and you think about the stress that it actually chews up, the avoiding people in the corridor, not answering phone calls, all that kind of thing. It happens all the time. But if we understand that it's actually so much better, A, to be as proactive as possible, but B, even if it's got to that hairy beast, to deal with it, we're going to have a lot better outcomes. Absolutely,
because it has so much effect on our bodies and our immune system, because we're constantly in stress, and either it's a fight, flight, or freeze response. And usually we are flighting and just distracting ourselves with whatever it may be, either working different tasks to just avoid that, or even addictions would fall under that category, to just numb this pain that we've got in one way or the other.
Absolutely.
Now, we do know we have to have those tough conversations. How do we actually prepare for it? Because you wouldn't necessarily go into a conversation and say, all right, let's address it, get it out of the way. What are some of the tips and ways how we can go strategically into those conversations?
Well, I really love that you've said prepare, because that's preparation puts us into a much better context. Obviously, when putting off conversations is often when they go, they end up rearing their head, and that's when they can kind of go a bit crazily. So preparation's obviously the key. So think about, what is your intent? What do you want the outcomes to be of the conversation? It's really important to do this. One of the hardest things is actually to start a conversation. So if you do not know exactly how you're going to start the conversation, don't have it. You're not ready to have it yet. So it's really important to prepare that start. There's a lot of different models around how to prepare for a conversation, but the SBI, which is the situation, behaviour and impact model, is a really easy framework to look at. So that is basic, and there's different models that kind of stem from this structure. So it's really, what is the situation? Explain the situation, identify the behaviour that you're seeing, and what the impact that is. So it might be, Petra, I've noticed that when we plan for our meetings that you have, you've been late a number of times. I want to have a really strong working relationship with you. So, and it's important that I demonstrate to the team that we all need to get here, at 9 o'clock. So and having you come on time will really help me reinforce that. So it's just a clear identifying what the situation is, what the behaviours of the person is, and the impact that that's happening. Also, so we said the start was important, and the end is really important as well, because what happens often with these tough conversations is we are just so glad it's over that we don't actually ensure that the other person has understood the conversation in the same way that we have, that we're clear about what the next steps are, and that we're ensuring understanding. So at the end of a conversation, being paraphrasing what the person has said. So Petra, I understand that, you were late because your car has been towed away for the last 3 months. You're now looking at getting a rental car, and you won't be getting late to our meetings anymore. Is that correct, what I've understood? So just being able to get people to clarify that kind of thing is really helpful at the end. And understanding that it might not be one conversation that solves everything as well.
That's really important too. And just when you started this conversation and you called me out on my name, I literally was like, oh, what did I do wrong? I get it, but you've but you phrased it so elegantly. And I was like, it's actually not so bad, because what I liked about this statement was that I just want to establish this relationship for all of us. So it's not you did something wrong and you were late and you. But you've taken it on why it is important for you, so I can understand that now. But I think for having those tough conversations, it's not easy for either side. Like for the person who has to actually establish it, and for the person receiving it, it's not something that we say, yes, pick me because it's so amazing. It's horrible. But at the same time, it's also what sets clear boundaries, expectations. And I think in the end, our brain is still wired to be safe, in terms of we can predict what's next rather than happy. So when we know what's expected, when I know what I get measured on, I feel a lot better about myself than just being up in the air and everything is fine until everything is not fine anymore.
I think that's such an important observation. These conversations are a kindness. So if you're giving feedback to someone about a behavior that's inappropriate at work, that's actually a kindness to them. So I work very closely with Erica Edmonds, who is an HR/IR lawyer and diversity expert, and she's also a workplace investigator. So she sees the really pointy ends of where things go awry. And the most common feedback she has is from the person who has the complainant, as they call, or not the complainant, the other person. See, I am not the lawyer, but is that I didn't know. Nobody told me that this impacted them. No one told me that they thought that behavior was inappropriate. So it is a kindness. It is a short-term pain for a very long-term gain for leaders to take this approach.
Absolutely. And you also mentioned psychological safety before. Like, I experienced it myself, that everything was fine. I felt uncomfortable because I could feel the tension, but nobody addressed a word. And then from one day to the other, I was put in a performance improvement plan, and I didn't see that coming because I never spoke up. I thought my work will speak for itself, and their expectations to my role and my expectations, they were two different islands. And I just recently experienced that with one of my clients, always top performer for the last 15 years, very regular in the industry. And now he got his review, and he's on the bottom of the low performers. And he said, how? Like, everyone gave me praise, everything was fine, and now I'm literally the bottom of the barrel. How did that even happen? What does it do to us? And also, what does psychologically safe actually mean in the workplace?
Yeah, there's psychological safety is absolutely, it's critical, and it's the ability for everyone to feel safe. Everyone, no matter what a hierarchy is, to be able to give feedback, to share their opinion, to feel safe about doing that, that there's no ramifications for giving feedback. It's really important. And for conversation not to be just around when something's wrong. So this idea that, if one of your team members is feeling an emotional response to the fact that you've asked them to talk to you, you're not talking to them enough. We can't create psychological safety once a month. We'll have a once a month catch up with our team member. How are you? That's not going to work. People are not going to feel psychologically safe to share what's going on, to be able to share whether they're, maybe not a lot of personal details, but that certain things are going on in their life that are impacting work, or, where there's other issues, other internal issues that are impacting their work as well. Unless you have that psychological safety and that connection, you will not get that information. And as a leader, that kind of that data is crucial. You know, if you want a
Absolutely.
high-performing team, you know, you need to have that information so your team can, you know, perform to their optimum.
Absolutely. And you mentioned address the elephant in the room, emotions. They come up. Maybe that you're just so stressed about the situation, or something happened, or simply about the conversation, maybe tears, maybe anger. Everything could come out of those conversations. What are some ways to control it in one way or the other? Our own emotions, to be, nervous about it, but also our counterparts' emotions when they are upset or angry about the conversation.
Such an important thing, and this is what just can't come out of a PowerPoint presentation. So when we look at amygdala hijack, which is basically when our amygdala, so our reptilian brain, takes over from our executive brain, which is the prefrontal cortex, which is a very rational way of thinking. And interestingly, our brain and our body can't determine between a physical and a psychological threat. So we can respond in the same way as if someone's chasing us with a knife, then if I say, Petra, can you come here? I need to give you a little bit of feedback. That social threat can create as strong a response, which is absolutely amazing and understandable. So, you mentioned before fight, flight, and, there's fawn and freeze. And when we look at the different responses that come out of those emotional responses, they can present very differently. So we need to understand what our go-to is and be able to verbalize that. So for example, I'm a freeze person. Like which you wouldn't think so, like what Kate loses her words. But if I'm under massive threat, I just do not know what to say. I just shut down. So it's important for me to be able to say, I just need a minute. I need to gather my thoughts. When people, when we look at fawning, fawning is a really kind of, it's a more recent expression of amygdala hijack. Fawning is really about people pleasing and, oh, absolutely, Petra, no worries, I'll do that, that's okay. And that might sound nice to you when you're having a conversation with someone, but it's not actually getting to the root of the problem. So it's really important to be aware of these kind of emotional responses for you and also for the person that you're having the conversation with. So if you're having a conversation with me, you're my manager, and I freeze, you might think that I just don't want to talk to you, or I'm being really smug or something like that. So once again, open questions and space, and being prepared for these different types of emotional responses means that you can manage your emotion, because you staying emotionally contained and not getting over emotional will help me regulate my emotions as well, and we'll get a much better outcome.
That's fascinating. And, it comes down to self-awareness to start with, that, well, in the situation, this is what I do, but I know there are 3 other behaviors. So when I can pick up on things, even just the statement, oh, I need a minute, it's so powerful, because you take control over the situation again, rather than say, and then getting even more stressed about the situation and getting that in the wrong hole and dig yourself the hole deeper.
Absolutely. And lots of people are scared of emotion and they won't call it out. So when we work with our participants, with our actors, we had a situation the other day where we had an actor crying and the participant wouldn't even acknowledge it, just kept talking. And, we can talk about that now and think, oh, that's, they're so heartless. But when we're under stress, we do things that that aren't necessarily part of our makeup normally. So, having the practice, understanding what your responses are, is really, really critical. Even with executive teams, that we might think are really experienced with this kind of work, often they're not. And, they're worried about their expertise being questioned or their authority being questioned, and they don't realize that you can still, you know, you can still be inclusive and still have that leadership presence while not having the answer, while just asking open questions, while listening. You know, all those qualities are really, really important.
Absolutely. And this is why I love your work so much, because you know, you practice it in a very safe space, and often we don't realize how we come across. Like when I was a very young leader, I got my team members to cry because I, you know, was a very young, or I had leaders only in Austria, and it's very straight in your face. This is not good enough, do it again. So I did exactly the same thing, but Australia is very different in terms of culture. It's all about the sandwich method and so forth. I thought these are just very weak people, clearly. And, you know, I blamed them as you do as a young leader. And I just need to work harder and they will pick up on things and they just do the same thing. And it totally bombed. Like it didn't work at all, to say the least. And, you know, I think especially now, and you know, that's like 15 years ago. So I've also grown a little bit, but I think especially now where we work with global teams and we've got also another layer of complexity, which is different cultures, that is another aspect that we can consider or need to consider. Are you seeing differences with different what's the word, leaders from different cultures?
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. And it's not just leaders from different cultures, it's everyone working in diverse workplaces is just really important. And the language we use, just the cultural norms that we have, you know, that we all have, and how they clash with other people. It's really important to, you know, we use a couple of frameworks that help people understand that how they see themselves in the world is actually, you know, it is a beautiful recipe of their own cultural experience, their own personal experience, societal norms, you know, the information that you choose to interpret and the belief systems you put on that, you know, is different for everyone. And we also like to work in groups. You know, we're a tribal culture. You know, we're tribal, people are tribal, and they like to feel part of something. So we often at work create groups where there are us and them. So it might be down to your department versus another department, you know, the regional office you work in, the leader, you know, the leaders, us versus them. So we can create these differences and lack of understanding just from the way we create different groups and subgroups within the organization as well. So yes, culturally, again, goes back to open questions and not making assumptions about people, just asking what people's thoughts, what they need, what their observations are, can, you know, is the most important resource we have. We don't need to, you know, rather than going and perfecting models and approaches to how you have conversations, if we just sit there and think, well, this is the expert in the room to help me solve this situation, I'm just going to ask open questions and listen to them intently, there will probably be more power in that than any models and anything that you can do to research.
I agree. And this is also why I'm so excited to see that more and more leaders are also getting not only coach themselves to become their best, but also getting trained in being a coach to their leaders, rather than to say, have you done task A, B, and C? Because that's a thing of the past. Of course, there are obviously certain situations where it's more managerial based, and we need to make sure that certain tasks are ticked. But then in bigger context, it's often these coaching conversations that leaders need to be comfortable to have, and not necessarily already knowing what the answer should be or could be, but being curious about it.
Yes, and the actual cost to businesses about avoiding conversations. If you avoid a conversation with your manager after a prolonged period of time, you know, you actually want to leave the organization. You know, the cost, there's some very easy metrics that organizations can look at from their leave data initially to see any kind of out of ordinary leave, personal leave that people have been taking. spikes within particular areas around attrition, that kind of thing. Generally, those issues, work cover claims, those issues are little kind of beacons to say there's an issue here around the way people are either having conversations or that they're avoiding these conversations and they need to be had.
And I think this is something that hardly anyone actually realizes, how much of a big commercial impact the wrong culture and the wrong learning environment actually has to a business. It's not the fluffy stuff that it's the touch and feeling kind of thing, but it has a big impact on the bottom line. So again, this is why I think your work needs to be everywhere and practiced all the time, because this is what makes organizations future-proof, but also leaders a lot more confident and their staff a lot more competent and also excited to work, because they know what to expect, they know how to address those conversations, they feel safe, and they want to be and do their best.
Oh, absolutely. And the best thing is that this training, as you mentioned earlier, can be applied anywhere.
Mm-hmm.
And I use it on my children all the time. I went away. My mum may or may not be open to me sharing this, but we were in the car the other day. It was a very stressful car ride, and I was using a breathing technique that we practice around amygdala hijack. It's simple box breathing. So 4 in, hold for 4, 4 out, hold for 4. Now, it is quite amazing how effective that breathing is when you're in a highly stressful situation. So this is one of the reasons we have this kind of training at an organizational level is that we didn't have it at school, and we should,
Yes,
these
exactly.
are fundamental skills that we need to have as humans that interact with each other. So, learn them at work and practice them at home and practice them with your kids and your neighbors, and things will be better.
They will be. Because conversations is what connects us all the time. The exciting conversation, the joyful conversations, but also those tough conversations. And I mean, in a partnership, how often do you have a tough conversations? Maybe, or you didn't put the toothpaste away to something more severe. But if you can manage all of those little and big nuances, you feel a lot more, what's the word for it? In control, probably, or I'm not sure what's the right word to say that actually.
Well, I think that it's a space where you can express yourself.
Yes.
And you feel safe. Like it's the safety component. So you understand that, that your need for safety is respected, your co-workers or your partner's need for safety and understanding is respected, and from there you can build. So, innovation and creativity is another side of what Sirius we do a lot of. You can't have it without that psychological safety and without being able to have those conversations. When you're innovating and when you're being creative, your babies are very special to you. And when you introduce an idea to the world, and especially an organization, you want them to be protected. So it is having these skills, are applied in every aspect of business and relationships and your next door neighbor.
Absolutely. And in the end, imagination and creativity is something that we are born with, and then it gets beaten out of us in traditional education. But this is exactly what keeps us ahead of the curve. It makes us stay competitive, because we can see and imagine what other companies or individuals can't see yet. And yet it's so hard because we are so focused on the now, the doing, and being constantly stressed, that it's hard for people to imagine another world. So again, your work, honestly, I love it, and I couldn't advocate it for it anymore. Now, to wrap things up, is there any one tip or advice or insight that you would like to share when we know we've got a tough conversation coming up? But even if we don't have anything particular right now, what is something that we can do to prepare us for an upcoming tough conversation?
Oh, one thing.
So many things.
So
or 3.
I would say a curious mindset is the key to any conversation. don't go in with an agenda. Don't go in trying to manipulate an outcome or a situation. Don't come in with prepared ideas of how you think, you know, what you think is really going on in that person's head. Just sit with the person in front of them, open questions. And with an open question, you need the space to listen.
Mic drop moment. Love it. Thank you so much. Now, Kate, where can everyone find you, connect with you, and learn more about your amazing work that you and the team is doing?
Well, you can find me at Serious Woo, so that's SeriousWoo.com.au. I'm on LinkedIn, Serious Woo's on LinkedIn. Love people to reach out and say hello. And yeah, that's the main things, on Facebook and Instagram as well, if people want to connect. But always love a chat and sharing the work we do, because it's fabulous.
It is fabulous. So I will definitely put all the links in the show notes, and also link your report in the show notes, because you've done some incredible work and interviewed actually leaders. So if you want to give us a quick snapshot what you've actually done there, that would be fantastic.
Absolutely. So interviewed 20 leaders from very different industries and organisational sizes around some of the challenges they've been having with remote work and with their teams over the last 2 years, and have linked those to Maslow's hierarchy of needs. So really looking at those organisations that were in survival mode and those ones that were thriving, and some of the themes and approaches that can be helpful when you have a team in that state. So, you know, free to download, makes for some great reading.
Absolutely, and I saw it, and again, there's so much value just knowing those kind of insights that it's well worth downloading. So I'll also add this link in the show notes. So again, thank you so much, Kate, for everything that you do, and obviously for all the amazing tricks and tips and insights that you shared today.
Thank you very much, Petra, for inviting me to speak with you today. It's been wonderful.